There's 4 critical stages every mixer goes through when they're learning how to deliver mixes they love. Depending on where you are in this process will determine whether you wake up feeling beat down because you can't get a mix to sound the way you want, or whether you're super happy because you feel like you could do anything. So understanding where you are will help you navigate your own mental state. The first step, the first stage in this 4-stage process is you don't know much, so you do very little. You're timid because you're worried that everything you add could mess things up, and you don't know what will mess things up, so you just add hardly anything, and as a result, your mixes at that point are often better than your mixes in stage 2. All right, so stage 1 is very experimental and more timidly experimental, so you'll hardly add anything. Stage 2, you add everything you learned, because at stage 2, you're learning a ton. You literally research everything out there. You go through everyone's workflow you can possibly find, but you're also just, everything you learn is new. And as a result, you think everything you learn is the answer for why your mix doesn't sound good. So you're adding everything on every single song. Now, what you're really doing is doing way too much. And in stage 2, I would tell you that you can't avoid this. Any of these steps, any of these stages you avoid throughout the whole process, you're only going to go back and have to retrace and redo that stage if you do that. So you can't force going from stage 1 to 4. You'll happen to get through it however long it takes you, and you're just literally along for a ride. Look at it like a roller coaster. There's ups and downs. Some of them are loops. You do what you got to do, all right? But it's necessary. So stage 2, you're doing everything you've ever heard anybody say on every song. This includes doing stuff like parallel compression because you just learned it. You feel like you got to do it all the time. This includes de-essing manually because you think everybody else is doing it, I must have to do it, right? It includes all sorts of stuff, including using whatever plugins somebody else tells you to use on the mix bus and a whole bunch of stuff. It might even include buying a ton of things because you think you need a ton of things in order to get your whatever you're working on to sound good. Now, that's just stage 2. You go through that. In my opinion, if you could avoid buying things during that stage, you're doing well. Because the more you force yourself to use the tools you have, the better you'll get with every single one of those tools. And a lot of the DAWs built in have tons of stuff, so you don't really have to go out and buy a ton of stuff at that stage because you really won't be buying the right stuff anyway. So that's stage 2. Stage 3 is where you start to be able to make stuff sound really good. And the reason you realize is because you are doing so much less. You're picking and choosing the things you want to add on every specific track within the song, on the mix bus within that particular song. You're picking the things you want. You're dialing it in the way you want with purpose. And this is because you've spent enough time in stage 2 doing everything in sight that you've come to the realization that when I look at this thing like I need to do a ton of stuff, it's always worse. As a result, let me see what happens if I do hardly anything. And then what you wind up doing is creating a mix that sounds way better and also way more like stage 1, where you didn't know much. And you realize stage 1 was great, but now stage 1 with all the knowledge I've acquired is even better. Because now the things that need fixing, changing, enhancing, whatever, now you're doing it to only those things. Because every single step you do in audio, everything you add, it serves a purpose or it's destructive. There's really nothing you could add that does like none of that. It's either going to help it or hurt it. And a lot of times in stage 2, you don't realize how it's hurting it. So if you're in stage 2, the way to get out of that, the quickest way is a ton of trial and error, a ton of testing with and without. And if you can't hear very well in your mix room and you're not dialed or whatever, however you make a mix and then test it, do that and keep doing that. You know, put in the legwork where you feel like, man, nobody in history must have gone to the car this many times, so I know I'm working hard. Like literally make it where you can't possibly look in the mirror and lie to yourself, which means you're trying as hard as you possibly can to get better, which means doing all the stuff that sounds crazy and is hard and is a ton of like try it with it, try it without it, listen to both somewhere else. You'll be, if you have AirDrop like I do, you'll be sending with AirDrop to your phone tons of different versions of the same song to listen somewhere else and make a decision, so you get more than just the way you feel within your studio. So you'll get another set of, how you can hear it to really determine the answers. And what I found when I went into stage 3, I found tons of stuff. What I was doing was actually just blurring the lines, which includes stuff like saturation on every single track. Because every time you do anything on every single track, it's hurting and blurring stuff. Even if it's helping on 1 or 2 tracks, it's hurting on 7 or 8 or 12. And as a result, it's worse later. I'm not saying you don't need saturation. Saturation is very helpful. It's great, but it can also blur everything in sight and make it way more messy. A lot of this depends on the type of music you're working on, because sample-based music that is made through, with a bunch of samples that were all recorded very well and where the arrangement is sparse, like music like that has a tendency to preserve its clarity longer than real instruments, where some of it might be tracked together, drums and bass and guitars, where there's bleed in the microphones, stuff like that. Especially multi-mic sources like drums and different things have a tendency to get blurry and messy way quicker, especially if they weren't tracked that well. And when you're learning how to mix and you're working on your own stuff or friends' stuff or people's stuff who send you stuff who aren't at the top level, way more than not, the stuff isn't recorded as well as it could be. And as a result, you got to be super careful with how much you add stuff like saturation to everything, or even on the mix bus, because the blurriness will hurt you. Like what I found was, a lot of stuff I recorded 15 years ago in a room that was really small, like a 10 by 10 box, something like that. And the drums are in that room and the crash cymbals are big. When I listen to some of those songs, and I talked about this with the drummer, who's a friend of mine, I was like, these cymbals just ring forever. And it's just like when you lay into them, it makes it where like it just sounds like this wash of cymbals. And a lot of that I know is the reflections within this little tiny box. And he mentioned this, the drummer mentioned this. He's like, it also would have helped, and he didn't know at the time, if he used smaller crashes. Like smaller crashes they wouldn't have rung out as long. They would have decayed faster. And as a result, there wouldn't be a wash of cymbals whenever he decided to play a part that involved, lots of crashes. So there's so much learning that goes into every step of the process. And what I found about stage 3 that becomes magical is once you realize you could do less and should do less, what you wind up doing is what's necessary to become a great mixer, which is you have to listen to what you're given with a certain mindset, which is, I am going to make this what it wants to sound like. What does it want to sound like? That's where I'm going to go with this. In other words, it's not really about what you want it to sound like. It's more about what it already sounds like, and can you get comfortable with that and lean into the problems and just sort of coast it into position of now it sounds like a record, but not now it sounds like some other thing. Because that's what I was doing for so long. You take the knowledge of stage 2 and you think the way to make the best mix is to always do certain things. Like you have a crappy sounding drum sound, always put samples on them and blend them in so that it sounds a little more professional, has a little more punch, a little more oomph, a little more whatever. You're also making it a little less original. You're making it a little less filled with emotion because it sounds fake. No matter how you look at it, in my opinion, I can always sort of inherently listen to something and be like, I hate how similar this sounds to something else, or I hate the fakeness of the drums here. Like, I wish there was more realism to it. And the stuff I always loved historically was always the weirder sounding stuff that was more unique, even at the expense of sounding professional. That ridiculous term of, something sounding professional really means sterile, really means the same as other things. It's really what it means. Because the best stuff, in my opinion, like when I was years ago and I listened to, when CDs were the thing and it wasn't, a place like Spotify to listen to stuff, or even YouTube didn't have the music on it that it does now. When it was back then, I remember hearing things like Grizzly Bear, Yellow House, and being like, this is weird and cool and I like it. And, weird stuff, Animal Collective, Panda Bear, really interesting, strange sounding material that was just, it drew you in a direction that was cool, unique, not towards what everything else I've ever heard sounds like. And because of that, I liked it more. So in today's day and age where we can look up how everybody's working and do everything, that's great for certain things, like building your set of knowledge. A ton of stage 2, it's great for that. But what you need to use, depending on what it wants to sound like, is what separates whether you come up with some original idea to make something unique. Whatever you've been given is probably, in its own right, some sort of unique, something weird or different and cool. It's up to you to not sterilize it, not make it sound like other professional recordings, like make it sound whatever it wants to sound like. To me, that's the beauty of stage 3, and it requires a maturity. And stage 4, the final stage, in my opinion, once you've done only what you need to on each track, which could be saturation or something on a snare or on a kick, or you want more level, perceived level out of it, but you don't want the peak to be as high. Like, I get it, saturate, do what you have to thicken, and yet at the same time, it creates the result you want. I get it, but don't just do it all the time to do it. That's the problem. So once you've gotten there and you realize that, okay, doing this helps and this doesn't, this needs this and this doesn't, everything I add could also be destructive, so make sure I like it, which means level matching and closing my eyes and blind testing plugins on and off to really determine if I like something, and make the plugin lower than the version without it, because if it's a little lower, then it really has to be better to make you like it. Whereas if it's the same, odds are it's actually not the same. It's a little louder, and you're going to pick it every time. So err on the side of make whatever processing you're doing slightly lower when you test on and off, and then see if you pick it, because then you really know it's better. So once you've done all of this, right, stage 4, put life into the song via automation. If you got faders, use them. If not, you draw it in. Using your mouse, you draw it in. You're making things a little bit louder on choruses and stuff, and you're pulling it back on verses. If you don't pull it back, you never have the change. So you need to pull it back. So many people don't like to automate because they don't actually want to make things lower than other things. You need to. Specifically, you need to make the dynamics what they are supposed to be. So part of the way the song wants to sound is, where are the dynamics? What parts of this song, and it doesn't matter what you call them, pre-chorus, post-chorus, refrain, bridge, depending on what side of the pond you're on, you'll call it 100 different things. It doesn't matter. It's about when you listen to it and you dissect in your head, like, what is it about this what's supposed to be loud, what's supposed to be a little chiller. That's how you determine your dynamics. And where and how you automate things, it'll either be easy for you, easy to do, or hard to do, depending on your workflow. So part of understanding that stage 4 is critical to making your mix sound alive. And this is the thing, anybody who thinks I'm wrong about this or you don't need it, you gotta try making a mix with all your levels static, where they don't move, and then do it where you draw in a little bit of automation, where certain things get a little louder and then they pull back, and they do it both ways. Listen to it a bunch of times in other locations. I guarantee you the one where you drew the stuff in feels better, because that's what I found. And a lot of this is a symptom of how you do it. Sometimes it could just be as little as 1 dB or something of a boost, or a half dB, but the way I look at it, nothing less than a half dB really is something you can really notice. Like, that's sort of what a dB is. A dB is noticeable by everyone, but depending on like where it is in the chain, will depend on whether it compounds the volume and sounds more so or less so of an effect. In other words, if you drive the volume into compression, you can potentially hit it harder and it won't do as much. As a result, it might work. So it's really how you work determines how you can automate in terms of how much you can push or pull. So you can't really say, oh, I can't give you numbers as far as what works. But sometimes I'm automating several dB because I do automate into compression sometimes. Now, if it's on your mix bus and you're automating tracks, you're automating into compression no matter what. But there's multiple ways to do this that make sense, and some ways that, in my opinion, I couldn't make it work. So everybody works different. Everybody has preferences. I'll go into my specific way to do that on another video if you guys want that, because the way I do it makes perfect sense for me, and I can't work the way other guys can work because it doesn't make any sense to me. So you really have to pick what works. Like my style is a combination, sort of Andy Wallace and Michael Brower. I combine those two, and I use maybe the way, Sherbin, which I've understood now, that's how you pronounce his name, Sherbin. So I'm going to sort of start doing that and be the only one on the internet who's probably pronouncing his name in that way. But, it's SH because of where he's from in Romania. So the idea here, and I thank you guys for that because that was some comments some people dropped, but the way you work depends on how you hear and what works for you. And the same way doesn't work for everybody. So the way you work could be perfect for you, but it might not work for me. I can't work the way Chad Blake does. And it's not that he works in such a complicated way. His tracks go to buses, his buses go to his mix bus, but everything having its own bus and the way he processes both on the tracks themselves and on buses, to me, is too much processing. When I work that way, I overcook everything. So I realized I can't work that way. It just doesn't work for me. Whereas when I have tracks themselves going to 4 buses, that's that Michael Brower part of it, the ABCD. Everything in the session goes to there. I have a tendency to do way less, which I love. And all the tracks don't have their own bus. Some of them might, like a multi-mic'd bass or something, DI, a couple mics might go to its own bus, but things like drums don't. The bus compression is B, is the same place there's bass, in that same channel B. So I'll go into this in detail if what I just said is like, what is he talking about? I'll go into detail, but not in this one because it'll be a 2-hour video. But just wanted to get to this part of automation being so critical. Once you do that, I'm telling you, a mix with automation in the box will sound way more alive than a mix using hardware and no automation. That's what I found for me, at least, is that the life can be brought to it and needs to be brought to it using automation. So no matter how you work, whether it's hybrid or out of the box or in the box, if you leave out that automation step, you're just at a disadvantage compared to a mix that has it in there. Because life is brought to things through volume, way more so than through another plugin with more compression and more saturation and now a bus and let's process it more. And I'm telling you, it's not about that. It's do as little as you can, and the life gets put in with the automation. But you also can't put that in until the very end when you're really close to everything sounding great. So the way I look at it is it's got to be able to ride without it. And then when you add it, it really helps and matters, and you don't have to chase your tail. Whereas if it's like you can't start that step until you are really happy with the balance you've achieved, then you can do that step. If you do it before then, you're really working at a disadvantage, and you'll wind up going back and tweaking afterwards. Now, that's another thing. Don't be scared to go back and touch your stuff. Everything you do is informed by the next thing you do and the next thing. So in other words, like, it's all context related. So if you set something up and you get your kick drum and snare to work and now it sounds okay, but then you tweak 100 things and change the guitar tones and you're EQing this and that on the guitar and the bass different and the vocals come into play, you may have to go back and tweak the drums. Don't think you won't. It all builds on itself. So keeping in mind that the less you do, the less of a chance you have of overcooking, right? That also means the quicker you can move through it, the better, so you can maintain perspective. And here's the way to get to mix quick. You have to spend a lot of time really figuring out what workflow works the best for you, because the same workflow doesn't work for everyone, like I said. And if you were to use a workflow that's going against the grain of how you think and how you want to work, if you were to do that, it'll take you way longer to make a mix. Whereas if you spend the time now, like spend the time while you're really trying to beat it up to figure out what workflow works the best for you, that's when you do all the trips to the car. That's when you mix the same song, with 4 different workflows, and you try to time yourself on how quick you can get it done. You do things like that. That's the research. Once you come up with an answer of which workflow does work the best, now you will save a ton of time on the next song and every song afterwards, because you need to really hone in to, I've picked this workflow this many times in my tests, so it must be better for me. It must push me towards the way I need to work. Whereas if you don't try the different workflows and learn all the different ways you could do things, it becomes very hard to do that. So once I decided on the way that I work now, it makes my mixes like I could literally get done in half the time or more, because there's no thought that goes into how am I going to work. Only thought goes into what does this specific track want to sound like, and how can I get it there in as few moves as possible. Now, the way I'm telling you I got there was by going to the car 100 plus times, by doing the same song in multiple different workflows to hone in on the way that works the best for me. And once I did that, now I never have to do it again until you decide you want to change. So what I used to think was always try a new workflow. And then I realized that makes it take way longer, because you're always kind of mixing and blending things that you should never really have to think about. The reason guys on consoles can do great mixes so quickly is because the last thing they're thinking is their workflow. That's the thing that's ironed out always, because they got a console. They work a certain way. Everything goes on the same fader all the time. It all gets bussed to the same places. Like VCA groups are always the same. They're never reinventing the wheel at the steps in the process that would slow you down and might not give you a better result. All the time goes into making what they have sound the way it wants to sound. That's all the time. And as a result, they get done quicker. So put the focus where it needs to be, which might be take way too long, like spend way too many hours working on stuff until you hone in on your workflow, on exactly the one you'd like to use. And don't feel bad if that takes a really long time, because I did it too. And I think everybody goes through that. Okay, that's a stage in the process. That's right before you get comfortable. So that's very uncomfortable, that stage, but you have to do it. It's going to take a long time, plenty of trips to the car, and plenty of print a version 2 or 3 ways, which is better. Plenty of that. Trust me. And then you'll be okay. Like, that ends. That doesn't go on forever. But while you're in it, you may be thinking, I can't keep doing this. It's like, I can't. And you'll also be thinking, is this helping or hurting? Am I just wasting my time? You'll be thinking that. That's normal. That's just before you see the light. I'm telling you. So questions, comments, answers, throw it in there. I really want to hear from you guys. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. If you want me to do it next video, I'll go into just how I break the session up in a way that works best for me, so you can add that to the possibilities of how you might work. But I hope that helped, all right? Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. We are not alone. We're all in this together, and you guys got this. Take it easy.